Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Pete's CD and LP World. Today, I'm going to be ranking the albums of the 80s band Dokken. Dokken's one of my favorite bands that came out of that era. And a lot of times they get classified as a hair metal band. But in general, besides their look, they're always a little more heavy. And the musicianship and songwriting was always a little bit better than some of the other bands from that era. Unfortunately, they got classified or lumped into other bands in the late 80s like Poison, Warrant, Slaughter. But really, Dokken came out in that earlier group of hard rock bands around 83. Twisted Sister, Rat, and the Scorpions. Although the Scorpions were around in the 70s, they had sort of had a second life as MTV started. So Dokken started actually in the late 70s. They were a club band, oftentimes played in the same clubs as Van Halen and Quiet Riot. At that time, I don't believe George Lynch or any of the other guys were in the band at the time. George Lynch was in a band called The Boys, which used to open for Van Halen frequently. And Don Dokken, I think, originally had a record deal out of Germany, which the first album, Breaking the Chains, was, I think, released there initially. And then eventually they went to and signed with Elektra Records and released Breaking the Chains in 1983. So I want to preface this by saying that I'm only going to be ranking the albums worst to best through Erase the Slate. Because I kind of feel like after that album, I believe that's when Jeff Pilson left. And after that, Don Dokken had just a slew of musicians and guitar players. And I actually have not heard a lot of those albums. I've heard some of them here and there. They're okay. They're pretty good, but they don't actually have that same Dokken spirit as the originals. So, taking there, my least favorite Dokken album was released in 1990. Where is it? I believe it was 1996. It was Shadowlife. So Dokken got back together in I believe 95. Maybe this was actually 97. With this Dysfunctional album. A couple years later, they came up with this, and a lot of people said at the time it sort of has a grungy feel to it. That's true in some cases, but the songs themselves don't really have those catchy choruses. There's not out of this album is probably the least George Lynch like playing you'll hear. There's very few solos on the album. If they are, they're just sort of playing what the rhythm guitars are playing, just a higher octave above, things like that. That being said, there is some good songs on here. There's nothing horrible. Puppet on the String is pretty good. I Feel is pretty good. There's a couple ballads on here, Bitter Regret, that are pretty. So overall, it's a pretty okay album. It's typical of a lot of 80s bands, what they did in the 90s. They signed to CMC International or whoever, and they put out a modern sounding album and got away from their hard rock roots. So this was pretty much the end of the classic lineup of Dokken as we know it. They've had a couple reunions since. And moving on to the next one, surprisingly, I don't own this anymore. I used to own it on vinyl. Back in the mid-90s, I had sold a bunch of vinyl, and I guess this was in there, and I thought I had replaced it on CD, but I hadn't. Anyway, it's Dokken Breaking the Change, which is their first album. This album came out in, I believe, 1983. Contains two of their biggest songs, Breaking the Chains and Paris is Burning. The rest of the album is pretty good. It's nothing special, though. I think a lot of these songs were written before George Lynch was actually in the band. And Jeff Pilson did not play on this album. Juan Crozier from Rat played on the album. I think Jeff Pilson might have joined during that tour, because I don't believe there's any live footage of Juan playing with them. I may be wrong about that. But overall, it's a pretty good album for its time. It's definitely, when you listen to it, you're definitely under the impression that this is the band's first album, though. Moving on is 1999's Erase the Slate. So after this, was it after Shadowlife, George Lynch left the band. I think they had a huge argument at a show or whatever. So Don Dokken recruited Reb Beach, who's best known for playing with Winger. And at the time he had joined Dokken here, I think he had already played with Alice Cooper as well, as part of his touring band. And this album definitely gets back to more of the Dokken sound. The first two songs, Erase the Slate and Change the World, are classic Dokken. Maddest Hatter has been in their set on and off for the last 20 years. Pretty good song. The rest of the album is hit and miss, but I definitely recommend it if you see it. And to me, it's probably their last album that can really qualify as a Dokken band album, as opposed to a Don Dokken solo album with a bunch of players around him. But overall, it's enjoyable, especially if you're a Reb Beach fan. I like Reb Beach's playing, and he does fit in well. And right after this tour, they released a live album called Live from the Sun and a DVD that's actually pretty good as well. So you can hear Reb play all the old classic Dokken tunes. Next up was their reunion album, Dysfunctional. This came out in '95, and originally this was planned, I believe, as a Don Dokken solo album. So all of the tracks were recorded when they got George Lynch to come on board. And it's definitely different than their classic Dokken sound. But at the same time, the choruses and melodies are definitely there. A lot of Beatles influence on this album. Harmony, vocals. I wouldn't say it's George Lynch's greatest album. They were still sort of trying to fit in, I think, with the grunge era with this. But it's definitely a strong album. They even do a cover of From the Beginning from ELP on here. Some of the best songs on here are Inside Looking Out, Hole in My Head, The Maze, Too High to Fly. Too High to Fly was the first single from this. Got some radio airplay. From what I've read, this album sold about 300,000 copies or so, which is pretty good in '95, considering. But overall, I definitely think this is a pretty good album. So you should pick this up if you're a George Lynch fan or a Dokken fan. Now, my next pick might surprise some people, because usually this is Dokken's favorite album. Their favorite Dokken album, I must say. But I'm going to put it at number 3. It's Tooth and Nail. And this album is great from start to finish. It has some of their biggest hits: Tooth and Nail, Just Got Lucky, Into the Fire, Alone Again, which is their big ballad. But again, every song is great on here. Turn on the Action, Don't Close Your Eyes, Heartless Heart, When Heaven Comes Down. There's not one song on here that's bad. But reason I'm lowering it a little bit is because the production is a little bit flat. Not too much dynamics as far as the production goes. And George Lynch's playing is great, but to me, the top 3 albums are just interchangeable anytime. I might say this is their number 2 at any point. I didn't realize how many. This was a promo copy, gold stamp promo copy. I think it's a white label promo actually, and I never realized how many promo copies I have of albums. But anyway, great album right here, metal classic. My number 2 is their 1988 album, Back for the Attack. I think this is the first album I got from them that was actually brand new. And I had heard Burning Like a Flame. I think that was the first single released from this album. And this is another one. It's got 13 songs, maybe 1 or 2 songs too long. I would have trimmed it. Maybe would have Stop Fighting Love and Cry the Gypsy, I think, are two of the only sort of weak songs. But the rest of the songs are just amazing. Actually has the Dream Warriors on here as well from the soundtrack. I think that came out maybe even possibly a year before this album. Kiss of Death is on here. Prisoner's a great song. No one seems to remember. Burning Like a Flame, Lost Behind the Wall, Sleepless Nights. Another thing about this album is George Lynch's guitar tone on here is just unbelievable. He really stripped down his tone on here, so he got rid of a lot of that process sound he had on the first few albums, where you could just really hear the great sounding Marshalls he had. So this is why I ranked this album so high, but it is just an amazing album. This is my original copy, actually. And for my favorite, which I think is just an unbelievable album, start to finish, is Under Lock and Key. This came out in '86, and this was a big, big MTV hit. Unchain the Night, The Hunter, In My Dreams. Every song on here is just killer. And the thing about this album, I would say, is almost every song on here could have been made into a video or been a big hit. Lightning Strikes Again and Till a Living End are the two songs that end both sides. Those are a little harder and faster. Maybe those couldn't have been singles, but still, the guitar work on here, the production, this is just definitely an 80s classic in my book. Albums like this and Back for the Attack and Under Tooth and Nail just shows you how much farther ahead they were than other bands like Rat, Poison. The thing about them is they had 3 platinum albums in a row, and they never did a headlining tour. I think that's what really kept them from exploding to the next level. By the time Back for the Attack came out, I'm not sure why they didn't decide to headline. They ended up opening for Aerosmith on their, it was either Permanent Vacation or the album after that. Maybe they thought that was a better opportunity. After Back for the Attack, they recorded a live album called Beast from the East, which was in Japan. They were a headliner in Japan, so that's a great live album also, if you can catch that. Another recommendation I have is, if you're not familiar with Dokken, but they put out a really good greatest hits package, which came out in 1999, but it's really comprehensive, and it even has a song from Don Dokken's solo album, Mirror Mirror, and it has something from Dysfunctional. So this really covers their whole career, and also has like every one of their hits. So if you haven't heard a lot of them, obviously nowadays you can go on YouTube and hear whatever, but back in the day, if you weren't familiar with the band, you could buy their greatest hits, and that was the way you got into a band. Also, I highly recommend, this is actually their reunion show, I believe, which was from the Dysfunctional era. It was an acoustic show they performed. So there's several songs from Dysfunctional on here, a couple covers. And they even do a song from George Lynch's first solo album. So I highly recommend this also. It's unplugged, but George Lynch actually plays electric guitar on here. So that's pretty much it. I also recommend the first 2 Lynch Mob albums. Those are really good. And maybe talk about those in another show about forgotten albums of the 90s. But until then, let me know what you think about Dokken, and let me see your rankings. Thanks a lot.